Good morning, everyone. We've got 10 quick minutes to do this, so we better get started. So, Suhasini, it's been an epic year for Indian foreign policy. For a decade or more, in a sense, India's big game was drawing closer to the United States. Even 6 months ago, people in Delhi still thought that that game was on. Very quickly, it fell apart. Can you just catch people up on, in a sense, how the events of the last year have hit home in Delhi and how India has tried to adapt?
Well, certainly the last year has just been one shock after another, because it's not just been about India's foreign policy structure. And many in Europe have often come to Delhi and looked at me and said, I don't understand what India is doing. You know, after 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was the sense that India will eventually shift. Many, there are many underpinning ideas of why India does not shift on these, and we can discuss that later. But really what happened in the last year was that the US made India crystallize its opinion. So the first was on trade, and the need to diversify very quickly ended with that handshake that you just saw. The need to suddenly make good with China. It was some time in the coming. It's like a year since India and China really decided to patch up relations, but the movement was very trade related. India remains dependent on China for semiconductors, also for advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, for the possibilities of FDI that weren't going to come from the US. Some of the hedging comes from Mr. Modi himself. This is a leader who spent 10 years of his life banned with visa bans from the US and from Europe. And suddenly what the US started to do began to invoke some of those images. So we saw a kind of response. The interesting thing is India has done best with the US at what most criticize India for, which is moving too slowly. This trade negotiation that has now taken the best part of the year has actually helped India, because other countries are now reacting to the US, and the US is becoming a little more reasonable, if you like, as time goes by.
I mean, I suppose my instinct is what is likely to happen next year is that at some point we are going to get a US-India deal that, for all of the shock and horror of the way the US has treated India, that India will still view the US as its most important partner, albeit a much more difficult and kind of troublesome one. And there isn't going to be a big rapprochement with China because the structural difficulties between the two countries are so profound. Is that right? I mean, if you were to look forward, I think a lot of people in this room might be, particularly given what Abigail just said, be slightly nervous of the idea of a more full-scale rapprochement between India, Russia, and China, as we just saw in the picture. I mean, am I right in my instinct, or are we being complacent about the way that India might go?
You're right to the extent that that photograph didn't translate immediately into any action. There is a Russia, India, China trilateral that was invented by Primakov in the 2000s, which has not been held. That trilateral summit has not been held since 2015. So in that sense, there was no new summit that has been announced. However, India is hedging when it comes to BRICS, and now the extended BRICS. Next year will be really interesting because of the problems between India and the US. The Quad summit hasn't been hosted in India this year. It's unlikely to happen in the next 2 months of this year. So in effect, in 2026, you'll see India host both the Quad with Trump, with Albanese, and the new Japanese Prime Minister, Takaichi, in Delhi. And maybe a few months later, see Xi Jinping, Putin, and the other members of BRICS show up for the BRICS summit. It's going to be quite a tightrope walk to run. I think one of the areas, James, where maybe outsiders don't pay enough attention is why India cannot be pushed off its perch of, we no longer call it non-alignment, but of balancing. And that's simply geography. India's continental challenges and India's continental makeup show us if you go from Delhi to Moscow, you will not find a single country that is in the Western orbit of influence. So India has to contend with that. It's different in the maritime sphere. And that's where India is able to deal with other partners and is able to partner up with the US. But it's never able to get away from that continental challenge, particularly because the biggest threats also come from the continental sphere. 3,000 kilometers with China, 2,000 or 1,500 kilometers with Pakistan.
Do you think we will get a US-India trade deal in the first quarter of next year?
Well, you know, today's an interesting day, and I'm going to discuss this with Milan because it's the first phase of a state election in India, of the Bihar state. And what we've been told is that the government is not keen to give Washington what it wants immediately, which is to declare it is actually going off Russian oil imports. And is likely to do so once these elections are over. Once that happens, the 25% premium on our tariffs that Trump put on perhaps go away. Negotiations are happening, according to our trade minister, on a daily basis almost between Indian and US negotiators. The new US ambassador to Delhi, Sergio Gore, is apparently now quarterbacking those negotiations in Washington. He hasn't actually taken over in Delhi yet. So it wouldn't surprise me. What really remains to be seen is some of the questions between the EU-India trade deal as well that have not been answered. Can India move at all on opening its market access for dairy products? Will India move on GM foods? Will India move on market access for crops that really make up India's 70% agrarian economy? And if India is able to do it with the US, there's good news for the others that are still negotiating.
What outlook for India and Europe then, given we're sitting here in Europe? It should be a big year for India and Europe next year. We have a summit that's meant to happen in the early months of next year. There's a new strategy. Europe just came out with a new India strategy. But as you said, there's still this sort of difficult, complex relationship with Russia, with the war in Ukraine ongoing. I mean, are you optimistic that as India tries to make up some of what it's lost from the United States, that it might undertake a pivot to Europe?
I think already we're seeing, you know, in India, conversations about Europe are far more than I've ever seen before. And just judging by the last 2 days, conversations on India in Europe are very much more than the past. So I am optimistic. January 26th is India's Republic Day. There is an invitation that's apparently already gone out to the EU's top hierarchy, von der Leyen and Antonio Costa and all the rest, to come to Delhi. Does that mean that becomes the deadline for an EU-India trade deal, the first part of it at least? That's going to be very important to watch. So that's in the first month of the year. But I think we still look past each other when we're discussing the hedging, whether it's Russia, whether it's China. The EU and India don't yet quite understand each other. And the reason I say it is just a few weeks ago, we had the EU's political committee come to Delhi at a time when India was doing these military exercises, the Zapad 2025 with Russia, Belarus, and all the rest. And there was such a shock and, you know, kind of reaction to that Indian participation that it made me rethink, you know, do people actually understand India's relations with Russia have not actually changed? Even if we give up Russian oil, that's going to be basically, you know, necessity, not principle.
And so next month, I think we have Vladimir Putin coming to Delhi. So is your advice for an audience like this that despite the pictures of bear hugs between Russian and Indian leaders, that we shouldn't panic about this?
I think the idea is if you are going to panic, then this is the time to say you cannot deal with the India-Russia relationship, because that relationship doesn't just relate to India's traditional dependence on Russia, to the defense support it receives from Russia. It's also about the leaders themselves. In a world where democratic traditions may be under a little bit of stress, our own leadership finds a little more comfort in a non-critical partner like Russia than it would with Europe and the West. This is not to say that we cannot deal with the West. We do share a lot of values. But to think that that relationship has weakened in a sense. I was in Moscow last year when Mr. Modi visited against all advice, I think, from European colleagues. And the truth is, I don't see that weakening yet.
Suhasini Haidar, our 10 minutes is up. Thank you very much.
Do I stay here? Okay.
I think I leave.
So we turn our attention to domestic politics. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has, of course, been in power for over 10 years. And despite what we just heard about numerous challenges, I think the key insight here is that he remains incredibly popular. So this is how popular global leaders are in their respective countries. Again, India and Switzerland relatively close together here. But Modi still, sort of out. The high tariffs in India have hurt Modi less than they've hurt the Swiss president, apparently. To unpack sort of what's going on domestically, including the elections in Bihar, Suhasini will remain with us, and I'm welcoming Milan Vaishnav for our next conversation on stage. Milan is the South Asia Director for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and has been a good friend of the HSID Switzerland for years. He's been a speaker at State of Asia and various other events. You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. And Nico, if I may, without you taking it too badly, the polls relate to a phone-in survey that's done. And we still need to find those people in certain countries that are going to, over the phone, say, I don't actually like my leader. So we do have to consider that a little bit. But we just discussed how important today is, the first phase of the Bihar state election. It comes also about a year after Prime Minister Modi got a bit of a rude shock in the 2024 general elections, where the BJP, the ruling party, didn't, for the first time, actually win a majority on its own. It now is a minority government in the traditional sense, dependent on its coalition partners. So the real question is, have we, 11 years into Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Delhi, reached peak Modi? Is it downhill from here, or are there more hills to climb?
Yeah, thanks, Suhasini. It's great to be here with you. I mean, I think peak Modi connotes this image that, he's climbed to the mountaintop and now is beginning his descent. And I would say he's climbed to the mountaintop and he's enjoying the view. He's sort of reached this plateau. I, for one, don't see any signs that we've started the descent in terms of his favorability or popularity. Undoubtedly, as you say, in the 2024 elections, for the first time since he has been the prime minister, he did not clinch a parliamentary majority on his own. His party got 240 seats out of a parliament of 543. But India has had a lot of experience with coalition government. In fact, every government between 1989 and 2014 was a coalition government. And if you were to line up those coalition governments by the strength of the core party, in this case the BJP is in a very commanding position, despite the fact that it has a coalition. I think Modi benefits from two very important contextual factors. They're important to highlight. Number one is he has a very weak opposition. He has a very fragmented opposition. He has a leaderless opposition. He has an opposition that continues to struggle with a unifying message that can bring parties together and resonate with Indian people. I think the second is, with the help of Amit Shah, his number two, now the Home Minister, some would call him the Deputy Prime Minister, although he officially doesn't hold that post, he has built what is a formidable election machine, not just in terms of funding, running, advertising, campaigning, but also in terms of narrative control, right? So I think he has many strengths that he can call upon to help remain atop the political heap for now.
One of the tools, if you like, the government uses a lot is the threat. The idea that there are regime change operations out there. George Soros is used more in Indian domestic parlance than anyone would credit, that the opposition is essentially a tool of foreign powers, and kind of clamps down as a result on not just the opposition, but anyone in the media that covers that opposition. Given all of that, do you see any opposition figure or any particular set of events or issues that could cause a dent in this, giant sort of Megatron?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to keep in mind, Suhasini, that, we are talking about a federal system in which India's states play a very important role. And I think one of the most interesting trends that we're seeing in recent times is the emergence of a coalition of opposition-ruled states, primarily based in the South, who are very upset with the way in which they've been treated by the center. They don't agree with Hindutva politics. They don't agree with the top-down approach. They want to see much more fiscal and political decentralization. And for the first time, state chief ministers from places like Kerala, from Telangana, from Tamil Nadu are coming together, not to fight for their own respective state interests, but to say, actually, we have common interests, right? And so when you think about the pressures that political pressures that India is facing, I would say the federal challenge is first and foremost. You have a kind of trio of issues which are all interconnected. You have the southern and now some of the western states who have done fantastically well economically, who believe that they're putting much more into the tax kitty than they're getting in fiscal transfers. Number two, you have a new integrated tax system known as the goods and services tax, which is something that the center and the states both signed on to, but the states are very unhappy with how that tax is proceeded. And most importantly, and I think which gets the least attention, is the fact that after 2026, the freeze on what we call delimitation in India, that is the number of seats that states have in the federal parliament, will be revisited. That breakdown or allocation of seats across states has been frozen in time since 1971. And there have been huge population shifts. And so, the southern states, and I think the federal challenge, is an important source of opposition at this point in time.
No, absolutely. And even though they get a bulk of the investment, if you were to cut a line across India, the southern half, that includes Maharashtra, of course, actually wins much more of the investment. But it looks like post-2026, it'll really suffer when it comes to political representation, and the backlash from that may be one challenge. From your particular perch, Milan, where you watch domestic politics so closely, but you see India's foreign policy approach, how much of India's foreign policy today is decided by domestic factors?
I mean, I think it's obviously, there's a critical link. I mean, I think one of the most important trends we've seen, and Suhasini, you've talked about this as well, is, it was hard to imagine in prior generations foreign policy being such a central domestic issue, right? And I think one thing that this prime minister has done is to sort of make this idea that he and he alone is responsible for putting India on the map, as it were, on the global stage, part of his domestic appeal. And we saw a lot of that rallying around the G20, for instance. But there are costs and benefits here. I mean, if you take the issue like Pakistan, right, where we've seen earlier this year this very hot, brief conflict between the two. Traditionally, Pakistan has been an issue around which the base has really rallied. But I think that conflict didn't necessarily play very well for Prime Minister Modi. There were people who felt that, particularly within the BJP ecosystem, that at a time when you had Pakistan on the ropes, you developed some kind of tactical advantage, you should have gone for the jugular. And instead, you let the United States and others kind of talk you off of that, right? So I think there is some sense that, once you put foreign policy front and center, it can help you, but it could also cause a backlash.
And becomes a double-edged sword, and particularly the personalization of summit-level leadership, Modi and Trump being best friends, hugging each other at rallies, and then you see the Trump tariffs, which, by the way, now India is above China because it's 50% and China is now down to 47%. So final question, really, if India gets through the tough bits, right? The US FTA happens, the India-EU BTIA happens. We do a number of other trade agreements that really put India back on the world map when it comes to investments and doing business with. What do you see 2026 as the year for India being defined by?
I mean, I think there's this, the kind of issue du jour in India, and it's been the issue du jour now for a while, is, can India take advantage of this China +1 moment? It's something that I'm going to ask James about. And my own view is that, India has made some modest gains, but if you were to look at manufacturing as a share of global value addition, or of GDP, it's really stagnated, if not declined, right? So there's a sense that not only does India need to get its supply chain management right, but it also has to change a number of corresponding policies in terms of tax certainty, how regulations are conducted, impartial rule of law, right? It's really people have called it kind of software of building the economy,
where I think doing business
this particular government has struggled, right? So they've done relatively well on core infrastructure, on digital infrastructure, on reducing some of the barriers to foreign direct investment. But I would just point out that foreign direct investment is still at a 10-year low in India, despite all of these things happening. So I think that 2026, in that sense, is a critical year. If they can manage to get the trade footing on a better place, these challenges very much remain to be tackled.
Finally getting its exit strategies right, because a lot of people will not want to invest in India unless they have an ease of exit too, and that's my cue to exit, I think, and let James take the next batch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to say I'm amazed how sort of efficiently you guys run this session. That's great. So we're going to go straight on, of course, the final conversation, look at India's economy, which has been the fastest growing of the large economies in the world for a while now. The problem is just that it's not growing quite fast enough to create jobs for the millions of Indians entering the workforce every year. And we did plot this chart that shows that GDP per capita just keeps growing at a much higher rate than at the employment to population ratio. So there is economic growth. It does not totally translate into jobs. There are more jobs, there just are not enough jobs. So with that, welcome back, James Crabtree. Milan Vaishnav is here. The two of you kick it off to tell us what's wrong with the Indian economy, if anything.
All right. Great to be back with you, James. I want to start from where Nico left us. I mean, if you look at the latest projections from the IMF or the World Bank, right, India again remains the fastest growing major economy in the world. It's very proud of that designation. Yet, if you scratch the surface, there is a feeling within India, and I think outside, that it is still underperforming, that a growth rate of 6 to 6.5% sounds great for those of us living in the West, but is actually not good enough, given the nature of the employment challenge and so on in India. So I guess maybe we could just start at a kind of 30,000-foot level. What is it going to take from India to go from good to great when it comes to the economy?
Yeah, I thought you summed it up quite well in the last session. So I remember I was last in Delhi in the spring. I think we were at the same event, and I had a conversation with one of Modi's economic advisors who in a kind of quiet moment, I said, okay, so we're in the third term now. How's it been going? And they said anything to do with digital infrastructure has been a smashing success, and it really has been a spectacular change in sort of India's makeup over the last decade, from basic connectivity to the India tech stack. Anything involved with physical infrastructure, pretty good. Actually, if you go out into rural India, the roads are much better. They're building trains much more quickly than we are in the United Kingdom. I mean, all sorts of things. But anything to do with what you call the soft infrastructure, skills, human capital, has been much more problematic. And so you sort of have there, I think, the economic dilemma that in order to get a sustainably spectacular growth rate, you need even better physical infrastructure investment of the sort that China managed over a sustained period. And then you've got to kind of crack this problem that India has never really begun to solve, that except in the very globally connected elite, the sort of skills and human capital and innovation economy doesn't spread down very deeply. And so I think that's why you have this ongoing anxiety about, yes, we can do 6-7%, but can we get closer to a sustained period of growth in the sort of 8-9%? And that's extremely difficult. Almost no country. I mean, countries that have managed 8% growth or above for more than a 5-year period. Thailand managed it briefly. I don't know if Peter's still with us, but Brazil, weirdly, in the 60s, and then China went on an extended period. But it's very unusual in economic history for countries to be able to pull off this trick. And so it shouldn't really surprise us, I think, that India, in its own way, is sort of struggling to work out the right mix.
So let me just come back to something that came up in the conversation with Suhasini, which is on this China plus one moment.
Right.
I mean, you look at India, you look at China, you look at really all of Asia, James, and I think there is a sense that if you think about the past couple of years, at exports that have been diverted or investments that have come offshore from China because companies wish to de-risk and deleverage, the bulk of those have gone to places like Vietnam.
Right.
And a small sliver has gone to a country like India. Do you see any signs of that perhaps changing?
I think you summed it up well, which is the progress has been modest. I mean, I have over there an iPhone that is at least assembled in India. It says made in India on the back of it. And that wasn't true 3 or 4 years ago. But actually, Apple is a really good example of the kind of problem that India is in. So you have one problem with trying to sort of mimic the Asian growth story of export-led manufacturing, which is that the nature of manufacturing has changed. And so now the people do less of the work, the people mind the robots that do the work. And that means that manufacturing just in general creates less employment. But then you also have the current geopolitical moment in which you have reshoring and de-risking everywhere. And Apple is a good example of that, where Apple went to India and said, great, okay, we'll set up factories in India and move some of our supply chain from China. We won't be able to move all of it. It took us 20 years to build our Chinese supply chain, and so we can't move it all overnight, but we'll try and move some of it. And then Trump earlier this year took Tim Cook aside and said, we don't want you to do that. So the last thing we want you to do is to start making all of your iPhones in India. Make them in the United States. And so, I mean, even despite the fact that it would be kind of cataclysmically expensive to make iPhones in the United States, and you'd have, $2,000-3,000 iPhones, you have a company like Apple which wanted to do more in India, which then faces the complexity that India is nowhere near as easy a place to manufacture as China, but it's not even as easy as Vietnam. But then you have these kind of countervailing geopolitical pressures not to create or recreate the kind of global sourcing model that worked so well for China and other of the East Asian countries.
I mean, this brings us to the issue of trade, right? And I think what's interesting is that, India does not feature into either of the two mega regional trade pacts in Asia, either the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the RCEP. And at different points in time has taken great pride in wanting to defend its own industry and not engage. However, there does seem to be a political shift in Delhi, where the kind of signal has gone out to say, okay, we still may not want to be a part of either of those pacts, but we are very keen to negotiate bilateral trade deals. And we've seen a trade deal, of course, with the EFTA countries, with the UK, an early harvest deal with Australia. We have the deal with the EU and the United States still pending. Do you sense that same kind of shift? And what do you think is behind it?
I mean, I think what's behind it is, I wouldn't say sort of panic, but concern about India's growth and the fact that India recognizes that China had the kind of the following wind of a supportive form of globalization and a calm geopolitical picture in the 2 decades that it rose. And India has the opposite. It has little supporting wind from globalization, which is static or declining, and then it has all of these geopolitical headwinds. And therefore, I think India realizes that it has to make a bit more of the weather itself. And as you say, we could have a kind of peace deal with the Americans, a full trade deal with the Europeans, and more of these bilateral deals. The challenge that India has, which is one that you would know better than I, is really a political economy challenge, which is that when half of your population on some measures live in rural areas and you have this enormously politically important agriculture sector, then it's very difficult to do these liberalizing rules. And that's the problem that they're facing with the Americans. They'll probably get over that. But doing full-fat trade deals in which you don't liberalize agriculture is just really difficult. And so until India develops to a level where agriculture is less economically and therefore less politically important, it's very hard to do trade liberalization.
So in the remaining 2.5 minutes or so, James, let us end on this political economy point. You wrote a book in 2018 called The Billionaire Raj. Those of you who haven't read it, I highly suggest that you pick it up. It's a brilliant and beautifully written exploration of the links between kind of the Indian style of capitalism and cronyism and politics. And that was written within the first few years of the Modi government, but we've had 6 or 7 years has gone by. Tell us a little bit about your reflections on the kind of crony capitalism that you described in that book. Have you seen any important changes in the intervening period?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about sort of crony capitalism is it does change and develop. And as you should all read Desmond Shum's book as well, which is a sort of fantastic insight into the way that some of kind of China's issues with economic development and corruption happened, and a kind of interesting sort of companion piece to mine. I mean, what I guess I've noticed is that the period that I wrote about was a period of kind of very disorganized corruption in India, where there were lots of corruption scandals. In a sense, what's happened under Prime Minister Modi is it's become more organized, a little bit as you would have seen in East Asia a few decades ago. So in Malaysia under Mahathir, or South Korea when it was an autocracy. Indonesia, right? So where you still have politically connected business groups, two in particular that are very famous, the Ambani and Adani groups, but they are focused on national development goals that are useful. So this isn't people just taking money from the till. This is favored business groups building roads and infrastructure and power and solar plants in a way that is helpful to national development, but which also creates this tight nexus between the governing party and the tycoons themselves. And so I think what you've seen since I wrote the book has just been a change in development in the model that is not unique to India. I mean, this is the nature of economic development in sort of industrial capitalism, that you move through these stages, and then the optimistic message is that eventually you move beyond them. If you continue to reform your economy and you continue to try and shift away from this model of cronyism to one that is more rules-based and more innovation-based, then, and so in a sense, I think you could say that India's model has progressed in the last decade, and hopefully it will continue to do so.
All right, and in the lunch break, you can ask James whether or not we have signs that it's moving to beyond the existing model. James Crabtree, thanks very much.
Thank you.